Choose you this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. It's Budgie Buddy Joshua's Autobiography with the wonderful coincidence of editing and uploading it on Father's Day. I was born in 1981 to a hardcore drug addict. Upon birth, I was missing 20% of my brain and hooked on narcotics. I was beaten when I wouldn't behave and eventually sold as a sex slave, being sodomized to the point of needing surgery to save my life. I was forced to care for my 2 younger brothers for days at a time, then injected with drugs when my biological birthing person got home to start the, quote, party with all of our adult, quote, friends. Most of them males, most of the time. I witnessed a murder during one of these, quote, parties, also having my jaw and nose broken, being punched in the face during separate occasions. I was also treated like an adult until I was almost 5 years old when I ended up in a hospital. It was a mental hospital to treat me for, quote, ADHD with medication and hope I didn't need to be left in an asylum. I don't know if they would have ever taken care of my internal damage from the earlier sexual abuse. Thank God for my adoptive parents, Gary and Paula, because they took care of it all. They had been foster care parents for years, probably closer to a decade, and had psychological development training before they heard about me. When they did get me, they had already had a couple of their own children and over 50 foster children over the years and wanted more children of their own, but couldn't do it biologically anymore, so they wanted to adopt me and my 2 younger biological brothers from the, quote, child protective system, and they wanted to do it ASAP. One of my parents' most, quote, controversial beliefs was that you never medicate children to modify behavior. They believed that hospitals, doctors, and pills were not needed to fix psychological issues with abused children. Being honest, valuing discipline, and a strong work ethic were the most important to being able to provide what is really needed. That is a strong nuclear Christian family dedicated for life to the decisions they choose, like marriage and children. They told me I was an experiment to see if the church was right and the government was wrong about how to raise surviving children of severe domestic abuse and violence, any child abuse at any level of recovery, or none at all. My 2 biological brothers were kept separate from me and my new family by the government. The government used the excuse that my parents were, quote, overwhelmed by the rules and regulations already and were lucky to have gotten a chance at me at all. In reality, it was a money laundering scheme with Child Protective Services at the helm. My biological brothers were placed with a severely abusive farm couple for 2 years while my adoptive parents continued to fight to save them from all of this abuse. After my parents made a lot of progress with me in a short time while remaining serious about adopting me the entire time, the government suddenly made it extremely difficult to continue with the adoption proceedings, saying that my biological birthing person was suddenly now entitled to me. Actually, it was all money laundering again. My parents had saved the government a lot of money in, quote, healthcare costs fixing my, quote, ADHD for free, and now they wanted to go back to making money off the welfare and child support handout I'd provided back in Linda's custody. Gary and Paula won that battle, but it was too late for my 2 younger brothers. They could have been saved at young ages, but instead had another long-term abusive caretaker situation, making 2 in a row, and by the time Gary and Paula had gotten custody of them, they were older than I was when I was introduced to the Demers family and before we were all separated. The middle-aged brother Merlin ended up in an asylum at 9 years old, and the youngest turned out to be a pathological liar who has 2 neglected children out of wedlock. However, I turned out to be a near model citizen, but the damage and rewiring done during early childhood development has left me much slower and complex-minded, as well as a severe case of psychogenic seizures stemming from a severe subconscious socialized anxiety disorder, emotional regulation disorder, and dissociative personality disorder. You can combine it and call it complex post-traumatic stress disorder. But I have avoided becoming a psychopath or a sociopath. All of these have been treated properly, and I continue to keep up with my mental health as much or more than my physical health, almost to a state of conscious awareness of my subconscious at this point of maturity and experience. I've been writing and recording this journey now since I realized it was worth documenting. This is part of that. I started public school, but by second grade my parents offered us the preferred option for private and homeschooling because sexual education was being introduced against the protest of my and many other parents at the local school board meetings. Also, the social problems us young abused children had were not compatible with the average mean mentality of what the common public school society was becoming in the mid-80s. That was for the best, and I continue to appreciate the double price my parents paid for our family's education because they still got taxed for the school we never went to. I also learned how to educate myself instead of being indoctrinated as a cog in the politically correct industry or factory system. I also got to learn at my own pace and eventually had to do almost no work to learn a lot, giving me time to pursue hobbies like taking things apart while sometimes fixing them, riding around all day on my bicycle, and eventually out almost every day on my boat by the age of 12. At that point, I quit school and ended up passing my GED with flying colors. At 16, I got my first rifle. Also, my dad gave me a job in a truck working for the family construction company he owned. I got to get a lot of experience driving a lot of big crazy vehicles and trailers while learning how buildings are built from the ground up. After 2 years, the company ended and I had a handful of jobs over the next few years, ending up for a decade at a privately owned tire shop until the seizures that were predicted early to eventually show up later caused me to retire early. This seizure disorder was no mystery to a real psychiatrist, but during the struggle to keep my job, I had to hire a neurologist and try to solve my seizures out of poverty-stricken desperation to regain my ability to work and drive legally. When it turned out to indeed be the psychiatric condition that was predicted, the neurologist tried to keep control and profit by prescribing antidepressants to buy time while telling me it was my fault he was failing, unless I wasn't really having seizures because I was lying about symptoms and faking the seizures despite multiple events with witnesses and ambulance evacuations. The only way to prove to a doctor that these seizures were factual was to front $10,000 after seeing a sleep specialist to get another referral after being referred to him to be referred to a sleep center 3 states away for 10 weeks of EEG testing to prove I'm really having these seizures with a machine that cannot deceive. The system must be set up to fail. How could I afford outrageous testing, transportation, and hotel stay when I was struggling just to pay rent working full time? Then I had to leave work for almost 3 months, expecting to still have a job when I was solo in my job position. Not to mention the mentality of it all. I'm already a child abuse survivor short on brain matter, and what's left is wired to extremes due to it. My brain has been socially anxiety disordered to near death, forcing me to never be able to earn a decent wage even though I've always had a full-time job. And I'm expected to continually behave perfect. My coping skills had been so amazing to that point that it was practically forgotten by society that I was severely damaged, but eventually it caught up with me in the form of chronic insomnia that had been there most of my life, so I'd never noticed. But later, after these seizures became the final symptom, and this referral planted the seeds for me to eventually figure it all out on my own. Even working full-time, I could never earn more than a poverty-level wage due to my disabilities. Suddenly, after my first major seizure, I became a lot poorer, a lot quicker. In the blink of an eye, I lost my vehicle I'd put my life into to make sure that I could drive 25 miles to work every day. And my backup vehicle would do me no good as my license was instantly taken away even though I had committed no crime. My job was also at serious risk because of the same problem that the driver's license had. They didn't want me around falling out in seizures. So I was expected to solve this by hiring a neurologist. Despite all the hospital debts, the neurologist bills, and all the suffering and trouble and decreased wages as more of it was going to rent and a lower quality of life, none of this was solving these seizures. The ambulance would come, charge me $20,000, $30,000 to clean me up out of public when somebody else would call, but the vast majority of the time, my outcome would have been no difference if they'd shown up or not. In fact, sometimes it was worse because then I was walking back to my job from several miles from the hospital right after recovering from a seizure because, they weren't going to spend to keep me there any longer than they absolutely had to. And it seemed like I was paying the neurologist to call me names, experiment, and eventually tell me I'm not rich enough to be trusted with medication, without ever telling me I even needed the medication or that it even existed at that point. I was also hundreds of thousands of dollars in hospital debts. My seizures were never being solved, and I was paying part of my check to this neurologist to call me a liar because I wasn't rich enough to test that I wasn't, while I'm becoming desperate and depressed this entire time. He practically said he can't fix my seizures with the epilepsy medication, and without that video electroencephalogram monitoring test, there was nothing he could do. At that point, I begged him for an affordable direction, and he supported my suicide ideation when I brought it up, telling me to go ahead and do it, which was jumping in front of highway traffic outside of his office. He should have called me into emergency services, but he didn't. Eventually, I ended up in and out of the psychiatric ward many times over many years after this. Again, hundreds of thousands of dollars, never solving what was wrong, just cleaning me up out of public view when I'd fall out, waiting for it to happen again. Someone at the hospital finally got on the right track and began prescribing me the correct anti-anxiety medication, but never explained what was going on or what was being affected and how. All the while, they were telling me that if the medication worked too good or I needed it for, quote, too long, then I'm an addict and I need to go to a treatment center for 6 months. Back then, this scared me so much, I never used the medication hardly at all when I should have been using it all along as needed without guilt and shame, and accepted the reality of long-term access. Instead, this treatment from the healthcare system triggered my manic depression and anxiety disorder and caused me to avoid treating it correctly. It's why I require the video encephalogram monitoring for the doctors to be honest with me, as they will normally play many mental games with me, trying to find me guilty of something. None of this would matter if medication was never criminalized in the first place. I had been educated on what was going on and how the medication would actually treat symptoms, but not the actual problem, as it was already solved all along. Again, money laundering at the taxpayer expense because I never paid more than the neurologist and I go without medication due to lack of doctor visits for prescriptions. So I just suffer from these seizures, knowing that, sadly, every one of them shortens my life as they directly affect my hardened and enlarged heart with cortisol and adrenaline over and over, mostly when I try to sleep most nights. I could solve this myself with a trip to a drug dealer that would sell me the medication, but I don't want to be a criminal and judged as an addict, as I'm anxious and self-depreciating enough already when I'm doing nothing immoral or criminal because of my brain's defective wiring. After years of struggling to keep my job, juggling the social and hospital debt racking up at an accelerating rate, and outraged that the whole government system from birth to death was set up for child abuse survivors to fail after they are no longer profitable, my family finally got me on SSDI after fronting $2,000 for an attorney. We had been fighting for my access to the insurance I'd been due since my first seizures went, quote, untreatable. But 5 years later, as I'm homeless and having to hire an attorney, I finally get on SSDI. That's great, except they had just changed the law where I only got 5 months instead of the 5 years for back pay. Needless to say, I never got to buy any property or a house as I continued to dream about it. I also had to deal with a couple years of guilt, feeling like I was stealing or getting taxpayers' money for free. Getting the video electroencephalogram monitoring test done now is more of a dream of finally having a way to get insurance to pay for that test 10 years later, now that I've got the time. Maybe one day I'll get legal access to the medication long term and not be called a drug abusing addict lowlife and accepted as I am as a responsible Christian child abuse survivor. Getting my face fixed and medication may never happen, unfortunately, but I continue to live and learn as much as I reasonably can. I get better at handling people to the point where I'm now becoming a confident leader as I help manage my church's Saturday soup kitchen as well as my local neighborhood. I've got a clean criminal record. I've never smoked cigarettes or done anything more than experimenting with anything except medical marijuana, and I don't drink much alcohol. I become my own doctor of psychiatry and development, as well as a bit of a theologist, philosopher, and sociologist. My abilities in mechanics and electronics are outstanding, and I'm very good at the English language, history, and the Bible. My worst problem is the difficulty in bonding and the extreme chronic subconscious anxious neuroticism. Less so are my emotional regulation and dissociate personality disorders, and lastly is my cluttered lifestyle and living areas. I am filled with the Holy Spirit, and it is the opposite of getting a single mother pregnant, doing drugs, and ending up in prison like the extreme majority of child abuse survivors who are never saved from this system of government laundering from the abuse and slavery of those poor children. I'll end with this. My heart breaks to the point of activism when I realize I should be the majority, not the extreme minority of outcomes, if not for Big Daddy government's profiteering off its most vulnerable citizens for generations.
Answer the phone, Joshua!